we continue now with our study of the Christian in the arts, today I want to focus our attention on a very important dimension of art historically as it relates to the church, and that is the medium of architecture. When we think of architecture, the very word architecture or the word architect means chief builder, the arche builder, the one who is chiefly responsible for bringing a building into completion. And from a Christian perspective, we're most interested in architecture as it relates to places of worship. And if we go back into antiquity, we know, for example, that God can be worshiped anywhere and in any kind of facility. That should be a given. I think, for example, of the experience of Jacob at Bethel when he was on his journey and he stopped for rest at nighttime. In the midst of his sleep, he had his vision of the ladder that went up to heaven with the angels ascending and descending on that ladder. And when he awakened, he was in terror, and he said, surely God was in this place, and I knew it not. This is the house of God, Bethel, which is what Bethel means, the house of God. And this is the gateway to heaven. And so he anointed the stone that he had used as his pillow in the middle of the night to mark the spot where he had this encounter with God. And that episode in the life of Jacob reflects multitudes of similar episodes among the patriarchs and among the people of Old Testament redemptive history, where they were acutely conscious of the reality not only of sacred times, such as were observed in their festivals, but also of sacred space. Sacred space. We see it, for example, in the Midianite wilderness when God calls Moses out of the burning bush. And he said, Moses, take off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the ground upon which you are standing is holy ground. It's sacred space. Made holy, of course, not by the presence of Moses, but by the intersection of Moses' God with him in encounter, in meeting in the desert. Now, again, the Old Testament saints were aware of the doctrine of the omnipresence of God. David in the Psalm says, where can I flee from thy spirit? If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, thou art there as well. The people of the Old Testament understood that no building, no square foot of land could contain the omnipresence of God. And so we're not to think that because the Jewish people had particular places that were set apart, consecrated, and sanctified as sacred space mean that God's presence was limited to those sacred spaces. But because of God's periodic visitation of his people in a redemptive way, these specific places became sacralized. And so to such a degree that Jerusalem became the holy city and Israel became the Holy Land, because that is the place where this intersection took place in redemptive history between God and his people. Now also, we know that in the New Testament, Jesus, in dealing with a theological discussion with the woman of Sychar, who set before him the conundrum of the proper place of worship, whether it be in Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans had their central sanctuary, or in Jerusalem, where the Jews had their central sanctuary. And Jesus responded by saying that God is a spirit, that is, he can't be contained to this place or the other place, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth, and that God seeks such people to worship him in that way. And in the New Testament, we don't find the reproduction of the central sanctuary like they had in Israel with the tabernacle and then later the temple. But Christians met for worship wherever they could find a place to do it. The earliest literature indicates that at first the Christians of the first century had ecclesiolae. That is, they had these little churches that were called house churches. And so they met together in people's private dwellings. They also, according to some evidence, although it's disputed, there is some evidence that they gathered in times of persecution in secret in the catacombs beneath the city of Rome. And so there were times where worship took place out of doors, sometimes in people's houses, sometimes in in cemeteries and so on, like the catacombs. But there were no established central sanctuaries in the New Testament. Now, yet at the same time, as the church grew in numbers, and we understood that the church in biblical times, both Old Testament and New Testament, is a corporate body where people came together weekly for worship and the celebration of the Lord's Supper and so on. And as we are told in the New Testament, not to forsake the assembling together for the saints. So wherever there were a number of people who assembled for worship and for prayer and for instruction and so on, obviously, manifestly, they had to have a place where that could occur. And the more Christians that became converted, the larger the places need to be. And so very early on in church history, you saw the establishment and the building of churches, church buildings, to accommodate corporate worship. And if you look at the history of church architecture, you will see that it changes gradually through the ages, and there was no one fixed architectural style that stood out from earlier periods to later periods, until you get into the Middle Ages where you have the Romanesque form of architecture and the beginnings of Gothic architecture in Europe. For example, the cathedral at Chartres became the first real magnificent Gothic cathedral on the continent. And in those days, these churches would take not just decades, but many times more than a century and a half, sometimes longer, to build these huge sanctuaries. Now, in the corporate worship of Israel and in the central sanctuary of Israel in the Old Testament, the single most important concept of the tabernacle or of the temple was the concept of the holy. That's why you have this notion of sacred space, holy space. The tabernacle and the temple have your outer court, the court of the Gentiles, then you have the holy place, and then you have the Sanctus Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies, the supremely holy place, which is that inner sanctum where only the high priest can venture, and that but once a year. Well, in the medieval churches, when the church was trying to find a way to express artistically their concept of sanctuary, again, the central motif that was to be communicated in the building itself was the idea of the holy. And let's just look briefly for a moment at the pattern that emerged in the Middle Ages for church construction. And by the way, as a parenthesis, as an aside, if you want to get a wonderful, marvelous overview of the taste of the whole drama of the construction of cathedrals at that time, there's a novel, big fat novel, written by Ken Follett called Pillars of the Earth, where in the theme of the book, the man who begins as the head stonemason in the beginning project of building the cathedral knows that when he starts that labor, that church will not be finished except by his grandson, because it will take that long. to do it. Now today, cathedrals of this size look to us to be absolutely financially impossible, even though they could be erected in a much shorter time than they were back in the Middle Ages. But people in those days, in the community, wanted dearly to have a cathedral in their own town, because it became the center not only of religion but of commerce and everything else, as people were drawn to those towns and communities that actually had these magnificent churches. And if you've been to Europe and seen these cathedrals, you'll understand why people would be drawn to them. And sad footnote is that many of those cathedrals of the Middle Ages now are basically museums, and some call them mausoleums for the God who has become irrelevant, and proclaim the death of God. But they still have their astonishing impact on those who enter into them in this day. One of the typical forms for the church at this time was the cruciform, which the church was structured and built in the form of a cross. And the entrance place would usually be rather dark, and that would be the narthex, which we might call the foyer or something. And then you have these side sections to the church, where the church is kind of built like this. And you have seats over here in the side. Those are called the transepts, because they represent the cross pieces of the cross. And then at the head, or the front of the church, is the chancel area, where the preaching is done, the sacraments are celebrated, and so on. And the main body of the church is this section here, which is called the nave. And that has an interesting history in the development of church architecture and in theology. Early on in the Christian church, the church father Cyprian developed the phrase extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. And he likened the church of the New Testament to the Ark of Noah in the Old Testament. And so he said, just as it was absolutely necessary for anyone to survive the deluge during the days of Noah, that they be actually physically inside the ark. They couldn't just be cheering Noah from the shore. They had to be in the ark in order to survive the flood. So, Cyprian argued, for a person to be saved today, they have to be physically inside the visible church. And that center of the church where it all takes place was called the nave. And that's the word from which our term navy derives. The navy is a place that the navy is a group of people who conduct their activity on the water, on the seas. And so the ark of Noah became symbolic for the ark of the church, which was a means of redemption through the waters of regeneration and so on. And so the church undertook their building with this meaning and significance in mind. Now, also in these cathedrals and churches, you saw and see today vaulted ceilings, very high ceilings, and arched windows, and so on. And with the purpose of the vaulted ceiling is to cause a person's sensory response to be elevated. So that the idea was that the accent on the church building should focus on the character of God, on His transcendence, on the sense in which He is high and holy and lifted up. That's why they had the high ceilings. And if you even go into these great cathedrals of Europe and you look up high on the interior, you will see numerous stained glass windows, or even rose windows, with tiny little insets in stained glass depicting moments of redemptive historical activity, maybe the call of the disciples, or the flood, or whatever, the Abraham and Isaac at Mount Moriah. They'll have these artistic displays of major moments in redemptive history on these windows that are way up high, and that you would need a pair of binoculars to be able to discern the images that are implanted in this stained glass, which is very, very costly to produce, by the way. But the reason why they have all this beautiful artwork in stained glass, so high and holy and lifted up that nobody can see it, is that the beauty contained in these inserts is for God, because God can see it. It's for the glory of God. And so even down to those details, the architects of these cathedrals were trying to fashion a building that would communicate the nature of God. Now, I talk to my students in the seminary frequently, and I ask them if they've ever been in these kinds of cathedrals, and they say they have. And I say, well, what's your sense, what's your feeling when you step inside one of these exquisite buildings? And they all say the same thing, that they're overwhelmed with a sense of awe. Now, to that end, the architects of antiquity succeeded at their task, because that's exactly what they set out to do. They set out to construct a building that would communicate artistically the holy and to the presence of God. At our church that we have in Sanford, Florida, when we have our bulletin on Sunday morning, we talk on the front cover of a transition. Because we understand when a person steps into a church, steps into the sanctuary, they are crossing a threshold, symbolically crossing the threshold, from the common to the uncommon, from the secular to the sacred, from the profane, which means out of the temple, into the holy. And that is sought to be conveyed by the structure of the building itself. And that's what church architecture has sought to do for most of the history of the Western and Eastern Church, as far as that goes. But then, after the Reformation, we saw a decisive switch in church architecture, where more and more and more churches were built for more of a utilitarian function to accommodate the needs of the people who assemble. And the accent became more and more removed from this lofty, scary, mysterious, transcendent, holy environment to a more comfortable accent on this worldliness, where the primary function for the building is to accommodate fellowship. And so in that regard, churches became more and more looking like town halls. And one could hardly tell the difference between a town hall and a church. Now, we've gone through a completely new revolution of church architects since then, where now more and more church buildings are built to resemble an odeum or a music theater, where the accent is on the latest and the greatest in music, so that the churchiness of the feel of traditional buildings is overcome, because people have no sense of the tradition of the church, or have rejected the traditional approach to the church. They're not interested in the old, and so the new, innovative, experimental building houses a whole different approach to worship and the like. Now, what I'm saying here is that the building is an art form. Every art form communicates something. I remember several years ago that in the town where I was living, a major bank opened a new branch office in our town. And the first time I walked into it, had been open 3 or 4 months before I went there, and I walked in the bank the first time, and I just looked around, and the president of the bank was there, and I said, "Wow." And he said, "What's the matter?" I said, "Somebody sure put a lot of thought and money into the decor of this building." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, look at it. You've got, these paneled walls. You have Queen Anne furniture. You have Oriental rugs. Everything in this room communicates tradition, long-term, conservative architecture. So the message that you're saying with your building is, this is a place that's safe. You can bring your money here. We're not going to be going off on wild tangents and high-risk investments with your money, but we are an established, classical, traditional bank with all the rights thereunto appertaining." And I said that to the man. And he said, he said, "You're right." He said, "We did spend a lot of time considering what kind of decor we would have and what it communicates." But he said, "You know what?" I said, "What?" He said, "You're the very first person that ever came in this church that noticed that." I said, No. I may be the first person that ever came into this building that said something about it to you. But I guarantee you, every person who steps across the threshold from the street into this bank gets bombarded with the message that you have produced. It's subliminal. They may not recognize it consciously, but it's there because the architecture that you've chosen for the purpose you wanted to produce works. It does the job. That's why I say to my friends who are in the ministry, I ask them, have you ever thought about the significance of the design of your church building? Have you thought about the significance of the design of your office? Have you thought about the significance of the design of your Sunday school room? I said, because everything that we build like this is an art form. And at the risk of wearing your ears out, every art form communicates something. So I say to my friends who are in the pastorate, I said, if that's true and that your church has an art form, it is communicating a message. First thing you need to do is find out what that message is. And the second thing, ask yourself, is that the message you want to convey? And if it is, then the next question is, why do you want to convey it? I think we've lost the sense of the holy. And I don't think that Romanesque or Gothic architecture is the only possible architectural style that can communicate the transcendence of God or the majesty of God or the holiness of God. I just think it's the best that's been done so far. But I think we can learn from that, even though we can say, well, look, these churches were failures in the long run, because we know that the building style and the building itself in the final analysis is not what's going to drive the gospel. It's the gospel that's the power of God unto salvation. But if we want worship to be God-centered rather than man-centered, then we have to think carefully about the design of our sanctuary.